Hello, people. This week I read the history of Frederick the Second of Prussia. I read it on ye old Kindle. I love this thing. This is Frederick the Great by Thomas Carlyle. This is one of the reasons audiobooks and Kindle books are so fantastic. This thing is 21 volumes. You're not finding anyone who's going to print this thing up. I mean, I'm assuming you could. Let's be honest. But it's not like readily available. Also, 21 volumes. Even if they're just $10 a piece, it's going to be a lot of money and a lot of shelf space, right? And I could just get annoying if I'm being honest. But the book itself is fantastic and you want to read it. So what can you do? Well, a digital version takes up no space, right? Also, on the Kindle, you get that bad boy for I think I got this for 99 cents because it's in the public domain. I'm assuming you could find it free if you really dug hard. But for 99 cents, it's just so fantastic. I, in a lot of ways, would have rather have read this in school. Not that it's a boring textbook, but there's just so much history in it. Okay. I don't want to start this. I didn't do like I normally do. I should have. Because it's so long, I read it in little bits. And I suggest you do the same because this doesn't come across like a book. It comes across more like a TV show. Like a TV show that's really good that lasted multiple seasons or something, right? It's that kind of an energy to it. Our author, our historian, you clearly tell that he's read every scrap of information that might be pertinent to this character, to this person he's writing about. And then he chooses, what to put in and what to put out. But it's not, he doesn't exclude himself from what's happening. What does he say about the poor 18th century? Let me see. What could the poor century do, but at length admit, well, it is so. I am a swindler century, and have long been, having learned the trick of it from my father and grandfather, knowing hardly any trade but that false bills, which I thought foolishly might last forever, and still bring at least beef and pudding to the favored of mankind. And behold, it ends, and I am a detected swindler, and have nothing even to eat. What remains but that I blow my brains out, and do at length one true action, which the poor century did, many thanks to it in the circumstance. He's funny throughout. He has opinions throughout that are his own. But he never says I. He'll say dry as dust. Right? Like he's just some dusty old thing in amongst these books that's putting this together for you. I mean, it really presents the information and lets you make an opinion. But not like you're in the books by yourself. That's what he did. Right? So it's like you have this constant companion with you or who's talking to you. You feel a lot of Thomas Carlyle amongst the rest of it. It's very fun. I forget when he writes this. I think it's before World War I and II. Probably a good ways. But I think the French Revolution had happened. That's why he was saying that about the 18th century. Because that's sort of the cap end of the 18th century. is Napoleon and France going to crap, and you see a lot of the a lot of the degradation of France along the way here. We start with Frederick getting born. You sort of see who you're going to be talking about, but then he just whips you way back, because in his mind you can't understand this person without understanding these people. And so he goes way back as far in history as he can on the history of Brandenburg and the Hohenzollerns, the family that ran it. And a good bit of the front of this book is just a walkthrough in history. Funny stories along the way. There's one lady who, like, one of the guys owned a hunting lodge, and it was all rickety, and she fell through the steps and, like, landed on the antlers and was sort of limping from then on. She didn't die, but I'm like, Jesus, just wild stuff happens, right? Ghost stories. All these sort of things that are the history of this sort of family lineage and how we sort of came to this point. And it does have, it sits in your mind a kind of a way when you read his particular story. We do a broad overview, essentially, until we get to, I think, Frederick's father. I believe so. Now, the way the Germans do it, which is a problem they've had, is equal portions out, I believe, to all the kids. So if you're one guy and you own this sort of plot of land, and you have 7 kids, you can just slice up that land into 7. And you can imagine, you get all of the sort of the space of the German-speaking people. And it did that for a good chunk of time. A hot mess. In amongst there, the Romans came. This is where your Kaiser believes he's the king of the Romans. And then you get into Austria, blah, blah, blah. It's a lot, right? It's a lot to try and grab hold. But when you focus on one thing, this family, you end up crossing these points as you go. So in that, I love it as a history almost of Germany too. But we get to the father, and he buys Brandenburg from the Kaiser. So I believe this area may have been Austrian. Yes, I think so. In any case, he buys it and various parts of it. And now he has a kingdom, and he starts making it nice. The dad, we spend more detailed time with the father than with sort of this long history of German areas, right? But we've gone from reading about these poor people draining the swampy, sandy area that is Brandenburg and slowly building it up into farmland, all the way to this sort of first king of Prussia. From the zones that he owns, that's what he becomes. And now we have a sort of a small king, because that's what he is. The France is bigger, Russia's bigger, Polish king is bigger, Austrian Kaiser is bigger, Bavaria bigger, all around him, and he's just in the middle. But what he is, and our author likes this a lot, he's a salt of the earth kind of a guy. He's very minimalist. He's not into outlandish things. He thinks the French are, over frilly. He focuses a lot on his military, on trying to establish sort of reasonable rules, right? So we're in a time where a king can just take your crap and give it to somebody else. That you're a peasant or you're a noble. Wars that just run rampant, this kind of thing. So in this type of a time, to have even, what does he call it, a tobacco parliament, which is him and let's say 4 or 5 guys that he really trusts, and various guests will come into his tobacco room and mess with tobacco. It's he says the process of it, you don't just, it's not a cigarette. You don't just smoke. You get the pipe, you slowly load it. You'll say a subject, right? What are we going to do about this farmland? And it can just float in the air amongst these men without any social drive to an immediate answer, so they have time to think, or no obligation to say anything at all. And then they can, in the same process, give a suggestion out into the ether of the room, right? With all these other smart men. And then it's always something to go back to. Mess with it, fiddle with it, puff it a little bit, relight it, enjoy it. And also the effect of the tobacco. The calming effect. I guess the clear-mindedness you might have for a while. And that in this tobacco parliament is how he would come to his major decisions. And in that sense, you have other people who are having input without what he says is a horrible idea, which is the big parliaments, which is just ends up being hot bags of air that just blabber and never really get anything done. Which I'm like, in a lot of ways, you want them not getting anything done, but that's neither here nor there. But I like this idea, and I believe, if I remember right, the United States Congress used to have tobacco stations in the building. So you could go get, I think, snuff and the leaves whenever you were inclined. You were never like 20 feet from it. And so this idea persisted in a lot of governments. And you call them now the smoke-filled rooms, but in a lot of ways, I think there's better motivation for those people, right? So, the smallness of the group creates a different personal dynamic, right? And so, if I suggest, let's chop down that tree, and we chop it down and, bad things happen, the group remembers that I suggested it, that maybe I didn't think through what I'm doing. So when I suggest something again, they're like, I remember you don't think through your thing, right? Now, at a certain point, I'm getting the negative effects of my decisions, right? So you have that. And I feel like in a lot of ways that can get more done for people. Having said that, I don't see how that could practically run a modern country, right? There's too many moving pieces. In the 17 and 1800s, peasants are just farming. There's no, the people movement means there's a lot less issues. You having to walk to town instead of drive. There's less people, all these things, right? So I could see some of the benefits of it, but we've clearly aged out of it. And these kind of thoughts are some of the fun of this book. These are governmental thoughts as a broad-based subject. And you can use these characters to walk through those ideas. He has this tobacco congress, and they start laying out solid ideas about justice, about, what does he say, the husbandry of the land. Every square plot of his place he's looking at and how to improve it and moving people to it. I think at some point, I'm trying to think if it was him or Frederick the Great. At some point, because we have the Reformation happening, and we still don't like Protestants if we're Catholic. And I guess the Protestants would have been fine with Catholics, but Catholics weren't having it. So they got booted out of France and other countries. And he took a lot of them in. And not just like, I'm going to take you in, but I'm build you spaces for you to live, right? So you come in, there's a house, other families are helping you out. It was very inclusive in that. But he understood that you need people, you need farmers. Those farmers need to get stuff to market. Those markets need to be fair. A lot of fairness, a lot of salt of the earth to the guy. But in that sense, he did not understand a lot of the politics. But he grinded on it. So at some point, he ended up with a fairly strong army. Part of the purchase of Brandenburg meant he had to loan out 8,000 soldiers for the War of the Spanish Succession. So it ended up with a lot of cats with a lot of experience. On top of this, you can't mention the father without mentioning his love of giants. This guy had, what do they call them? The Potsdam Giants. Potsdam. I think that's how you say it. It was a military unit he had of anyone that's just as tall as he can find. You know, if you're 6'7" in this group, you're kind of short. Bunch of 7-footers. And he would collect them, literally. He'd pay them well. They never really got into wars because he kept them around his, house to watch them march around. It was just his pride and joy. It was the one weird thing that he had about him. And he'd pay for them, right? So at some point he had his Prussian agents in other countries. And when they'd see a tall guy, they'd be like, oh, I got to, go talk to him. Like, hey, do you want to come to Prussia and be part of this regime? And there was one story of a guy who's like in Ireland or London or something to this effect. And they're like, do you want to come be part of our Prussian giants? And the guy's like, no, I'm okay. So then they set up a whole sting operation. Like saying some product or something was faulty to get them lured to a spot. Then they chucked them and locked them in a big case and shipped them out. And I think they got caught at the border, and the guy got freed because he was sort of a noble and not just a rando. And he's like, these gentlemen have just tried to kidnap me to Prussia. And it was a big political mess. But he was very desperate for them. And then he'd make them marry other tall ladies and hopefully then produce big tall babies. Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia, would constantly be sending them. He'd send them 1 or 2 7-footers a year. No lie. 7-footers. And he just collected them. They didn't have to do anything. And you watch them march around. But he was also, what is it? Let's see. What is it? Temperamental, right? And this is part of why he gave you the history of the families. He sees some of this volatile aggression as coming from sort of the family line, the Hohenzollerns. Yeah. And that would just flame out of him, right, at points. And he got violent with his children, right? So, he'd whoop on them. You say it out loud, and I think in modern times it sounds worse than I think they would be taking it at the time, even at the time of the reading. So they're very religious, and spare the rod, spoil the child mentality is very much alive. But even to that end, I think outside viewers would say this is above what needed to be that, right? You maybe wouldn't hit the daughter as much as he would, or as hard as he hit the son. But he was this kind of violently aggressive in bursts kind of guy, on top of all the other sort of good that he did. And, of course, it has an effect on your Frederick the Great. And this is why we mention any of it. So we then sort of cut back to our Frederick the Great, and we start up on his life. And it's this sort of troubling upbringing, this very strict militaristic upbringing. You have X amount of suits of clothes. You don't speak French because it's frou-frou. I don't need you reading books. You need to study and learn military stuff. He didn't even like he doesn't even like him learning Latin because, why should we read the Holy Bible in the Latin language when we're German? Makes no sense. Like, it's too Catholic, right? So this strong Protestant leaning. And at some point, I think he was 15, a teenager kind of age. He tries to, what they would do is they would go on grand tours, the rich. Peter the Great did this. They all would, where you send the nobles out, they visit various countries and learn, and then come back and rule. So Frederick was thinking along these lines, like, I'll just leave, me and my boy will just leave. I don't have to deal with this getting yelled at every 5 minutes. I can play my flute and just be fine. His dad, of course, didn't like him playing any musical instrument. He liked the flute, amongst others. But they were trying to YOLO out. And they got caught. And he chucked them in prison. And he has a full-on court-martial. And the court-martial being that, they've deserted their post, which technically they did. And he puts his own son in a prison that overlooks where his friend is about to get hung. And hangs the dude, right? The other dude's found guilty. He's hung him. I'm like, that's rough. And there was a strong question as to whether he was going to execute his kid as well. But I believe the officers didn't have it in them, right? You're like, I'm not going to be the one that says, yeah, kill your kid. I don't know how he'll react to that. 2, I think there was some sort of ruling from the Kaiser saying that only by permission of the Kaiser can a prince of noble blood be executed. Even if it's by another, a prince can't kill another prince. Kings can't kill kings unless by express order, by a higher authority, which would be the emperor. This kind of energy. In any case, it was touch and go for a bit, but he ends up not killing his kid. Now, again, clearly had long-term effects on Frederick. After that, he is very much now nose to the grindstone. He's doing what he's supposed to do. He's no longer complaining. And he essentially does this. He marries a lady. And he just waits out until, his dad dies. Essentially, he comes to an understanding with him. But he doesn't like the guy. I think he, visits the grave once. And that's for the public funeral. Right? Then never visits it again. He was pretty happy to be done with the guy. His mom, on the other hand, he loves his mom, loves his sisters. Yeah. I mean, and he was, even when he was in war, he would take time to write to his mom and make sure everything's squared with her. Until, of course, the day she died. So then it's Frederick the Great now running the kingdom of Prussia. King Frederick now. And, okay, now it didn't come up in this book. He does bring up a lot of rumors of every kind of sort that got published in the 1800s. Right? And he says, I've read it. I'm not bringing it up because it's useless. But in just looking up outside of this book on the internet, you come up with a lot of, was Frederick the Great gay? Now, again, from reading the book, it doesn't seem like that he is. You don't see a lot of women around him, but I'm like, again, to these people, that's not unusual. I think one of these lords was he would famously not have any sexual relations with his wife. And then he says he heard a story of a guy who was French and debaucherous a little bit. And I'm assuming he got an STD or something, but he had sex with a lady and then dies. And then this cut to this guy and he's like, see? Yeah, you could get killed. You could get killed just having sex. It weakens your soul, or I don't know what he thought. It was so funny though, but it's. I know there was a time in the early 2000s, I feel like, where we had a lot of history book special type situations that started giving me the energy like, let's find a way to make everyone gay. Not that I'm homophobic or into again, I don't care about politics. I don't care about any of it. Can these people be gay? I'm like, yes, they can. Can they also not be gay? Yes, they also can. Two things. One, I don't think some of these cats were gay. Just because they don't function the way we function now. We can't put all of our thinking on them. A long time has passed. And two, I mention it because, well, two reasons. One, because it's interesting to see how varied known history can be, right? Like, we know Frederick the Great was a person. We know he was in these places. We know he did these things. And we can still have this wide scope of what we believe may or may not have happened. I find that highly interesting. And two, I mentioned it to sort of mention some of the history of these people. He goes way back, again, to the founding of some of these areas. Some of these areas, I think, what were they? It's a weird way. It's a weird spelling. Teuchland Knights. I can't say. I don't think I'm saying that right. It's Teuts something or another. In any case, the way back in the day, when you're still sending holy crusades out, right? We did some crusades down to the Middle East. That's a long way to go. So some of these cats are like, maybe I don't have to go all the way down. Maybe I can fight these pagans that still live in these Germanic areas. And that's what some of these German cats did. And they were so like dedicated, they would say, all right, we're going to rule this area, but none of our knights can have wives. Just flat out. You have to be celibate and a holy knight. And so I'm like, so I got to fight all day, not for a wife and just for God. They're like, yes. And a bunch of cats did. For a good long time, they did it too. I think they ran this area for like 200 years or some mess like this. An extended amount of time. Well, clearly, you have problems, with membership, wherein we're always looking for new recruits and somehow don't always get them. I'm like, I wonder why. But even the ones who did join, right? You can't say that the ones who joined all stayed. You could live that life for 10 years and then find a lady you like, fall in love, and say, I gotta choose my wife over this. And then just sort of sink into the countryside. So you have this concentration of sort of strong-willed type people. You're not going to go from that hard of a life, have kids, and then just have them be, loosey-goosey, Frenchy types. They end up very, strictly raised, a lot like Frederick, right? And so here is a zone of people who have this hard kind of thinking. So in that zone, I don't see it as too unusual to have then produced someone who is very, let's say, non-sexual, right? As odd as that may sound, they have different beliefs. And he was born in the soil that would produce that, right? I believe the king of Sweden was the same. I forget his name. There was a king of Sweden who fought Peter the Great. He never really had a kid. He was just constantly going to war till, he took one to the dome. And that's another thing. I think Frederick, because he never had any kids. He hardly hung out with his wife. I don't think he liked the idea, one, of being forced to marry, which he was. I don't think he liked, the example of a marriage his father set, so he might not have liked marriage to begin with. Also very religious. So he sees his whole life towards a higher calling, which he then did for the rest of his life. And he might not have liked his childhood. So I can see not wanting, to bring children to have a horrible life. Also, I think you might worry a little bit about dying suddenly, right? And then your kid doesn't have a father figure. So I can see a lot of ways that he would not just be around women or deal with it at all. You shut that off in your mind and you move on with your life. And if you're thinking a lot of them had kids to continue the line, he had a sister and she had a husband and she had a kid. And so in his mind, the lineage continues. There will be another king. I just need to focus on what I'm doing, which is what he ended up doing a lot of his life. But if you read that about him being gay, I'm like, I guess you can believe it or not. But I can tell you, I don't think Robert Carlyle believed it. And I don't believe it either, from what I was reading. Going back now, because I sidetracked. Going back now to Frederick the Great. He's young, a young, brash king. He's inherited a very strong military, very well-trained, well-coordinated military, and he's had a lot of experience himself. I think he went out and hung out with Prince Eugene, who had fought with Marlborough, highly successful general. So he's been around the best of the best. And he's young and he's confident. And he sees this area called Silesia. It's this sort of zone between his land and Austria. And he in his mind is like, that's mine by right, which I think it was. If you look at all the legalese, it was his land. But Austria, in its pride, is like, I don't think it should be yours. And what we then get is one of the best in-depth histories of the 7 Years' War that I've ever read. I was specifically looking for one and couldn't find a decent one. And it's because of so many things in the 1800s. It's so disjointed, right? You have so many non-battles that it's hard to get a grasp and center your narration. But he's right in the center of it, so it makes for the perfect vehicle to narrate this 7 Years' War. And you have this now influx of all these other people. You have a man named Lord Belleisle. I forget his full name, but that's his, like, Duke Belleisle is what came up so much in the book. That's how I remember it. In him, in Frederick, in some of these other characters, I see it a lot like the author sees it, where you've had hundreds of years of these royals, and at some point the peak bubbles up, and then it has to be downhill from there. So some of the best of what this could produce has been produced. This is Belleisle. He is everything that the old French wanted to be. Honorable, intelligent, tall, strong, popular, good in diplomacy, good in war, etc., etc. Right? So he moves up with the help of a cardinal, I believe, and he's high in the court of Louis XV, I believe. Or he's there just as the Sun King is dying. One of those two. Probably aged out somewhere. In any case, he's the pinnacle of what France wants. And you have latitude at that position, right? So if you have sway over the court, that's the same as sway over a government. You then get to set a course, right? And the course he set, which isn't unusual, is, France being the strongest, we should have some sway on these rabble in Europe to make sure everything stays harmonious. And to that end, he wanted to go partition Germany. He wanted to split it up. And there's a bunch of smaller kings, so it should be easily done. So you inject this guy in, and I think that's sort of how France gets sucked into this situation. He stirs a lot of pots. The Maria Theresa of Austria, very noble in her mind, couldn't let someone just take Silesia. It's got to be mine, even though it wasn't. That's how Austria gets in. I believe Russia got stoked a little by France and also by maybe Frederick may have called her fat. Elizabeth, Tsar of Russia. He might have said she a bit on the chunky side. Again, he was young, hot-headed. In any case, that's what ends up happening. You end up with Prussia going into Silesia, and then 3 world powers teaming up to fight him. And he has to somehow hold them all off. And because of the way he is, he's not going to get into debt. He's not going to cheat anyone out. He's not going to overtax his citizens. It's purely on the old conscription model he had. Sort of like a draft system. And his own ingenuity. That's what he's going to rely on. I think at some point money got so bad that they have fancy pillars coated in silver to be fancier. Strip the silver off, to make more coins. It got so bad at one point. Now, once this crap starts, right, he's like, whatever happens, I'm not giving up Silesia. That's mine. If I have to die, then die I will. And when he says it, you firmly believe it. He's willing to die. He charges into multiple battles. Doesn't die somehow. But he will talk peace. He will talk whatever kind of peace you think you want to have. He doesn't want a war to continue. Especially not one that looks so bad against him. Because the Russians are sending 100,000, Austria is sending 100,000, and France is sending 60. And they start running amok, right? And this is the second half of the book. Well, not the second half. A good chunk of the book is not describing these battles, but setting them up in a kind of a broad-based way. And giving you references to where more detail might be found. If you want every little maneuver, which I think is just very cool. Broad brushstrokes. In amongst this, enter one Pitt and I think George Washington, if I remember right. It gets kind of wild. Pitt is the British Prime Minister, and our author loves him. He's able to see sort of a broader scope of what's happening. He sees this as, one, an opportunity to strengthen their hold in America, and, of course, to weaken France. So he uses sort of Frederick, funds him some, tries to send them soldiers. He does send them soldiers. They're not highly effective, but they hold their own. British soldiers always hold their own. And we do cut to George Washington because he is working for a survey company at the time. And, has some battles with the French in Canada. And again, he only brings that up because later on, when, the American Revolution starts to bubble up, it starts to distract his British allies. And then they turn away from him and towards their American holdings, so to speak. And this is where you get some animosity, I'm assuming, between the Germans and the English. Whereas they could have, nearly been allied together perfectly. You watch it from your vantage point, knowing future history, and you just see these moments in history where the whole thing could have been stitched together different, and it's wild to see. He has a few major wins. He'd have a maneuver, which it struck me kind of weird because I was in a marching band at high school. He had a maneuver where everyone would go in one way, right? And at a certain point, they'd pivot 45 degrees, right? You're trying to drive into the enemy. You'd pivot, drive diagonally into them, and then, mess up their whole line. All, of course, while under heavy cannon fire and musket fire. That's what they did. It was all about how brave you were when your dude's getting shot in the forehead and holding the line and this kind of thing. Miles long lines of troops. But if you break at a point, everything's then just sideways to you and you just rickroll. I was thinking this because I was in a band and we did a pivot maneuver like that, right? Where we would go and we'd make these big diagonals. And I'm like, is that why I was doing that? Because I was practicing some 18th century war move? I should have told me. I'd have liked it a lot more. In any case, he has a few wins, and then we get to where that makes people very hesitant to engage him. Very, very hesitant. In multiple spots, they could have had him beat, but this lack of aggression was constantly at play against him. Also, long supply lines, and then, of course, we're breaking every winter, which is why it makes it so hard to tell a story of. But again, when you'll read it, and I wouldn't even, like I was saying earlier, I wouldn't suggest reading it all at once. Read it actually like 5 or 10 minutes a day. Let it stretch out to a long time. It feels more epic in a weird way. Read however you want, I guess. That's what I did. I read it in little pieces over. I think I started this last year, maybe. I was reading and I was nibbling. It's so fun. I don't know, in a weird way, I feel the time it took, right? Better when I took a long time to read this. You're going to feel it a little because it's so long, but make it even longer and it might be even funner. You can't say he never lost a battle because he did lose some battles, a lot of battles. A lot of times he had a plan and he had the aggression, the initiative to enact it. But then mud, losing one's direction, engaging the wrong enemy, various things that can happen in war happened and made him lose fights that he could have won. A lot of spots where it could have got wrapped up faster, it didn't end up wrapped up faster. And he was just on it 24/7, reviewing every, and him and Napoleon did this a lot, where it's a lot of talking to the troops. He sleeps out amongst them, very knowledgeable about his army, babying it a lot, very proud of him. But they got to their work very quietly. They didn't complain. There was none of this. If he set them to do something, they'd try their darndest to do it. It was like the perfect tool meets the perfect, craftsman in a lot of ways. And he held off all three, France, Austria, and Russia, all three major powers. He held off. I think for a while the Germans invaded Berlin. For a while he owned Prague. Right? There's great historical cities all throughout. It's very fun. Again, though, fun in this long way. Fun like a TV show, not just explosion battles. It's not Michael Bay. It's not Michael Bay at all. But it is very fun, detailed. Eventually, what sort of ends the war is the Tsar, the Tsarina. Elizabeth dies. And her son, Peter II, becomes Tsar. Now, Peter II is what we call a Frederick the Great fanboy. He loves him some Frederick the Great. And he instantly is like, well, Russia's out. I ain't sending no more troops. And if you give me 5 minutes, I'll ally with you against Austria and France. and anyone else who wants any piece of it, right? And everyone just lost the will after that. It was taking a long time. 7 years is a long time. It's very expensive. He seems unkillable. The myth of him continued to grow. And the whole thing just sort of falls apart. He keeps Silesia. Austria's angry. Russia's on his side. At least until, upheaval in Russia. And then Catherine the Great becomes in charge. But that's a different story, isn't it? And France is and what he says a lot is, it's just sort of decaying into its future explosion. The explosion being the French Revolution. That's how he describes the French Revolution. Because it was on the grand scale. It was a very massive sea change in the world. At least European world. Might not have affected China, I don't know. I've never read what the Chinese thought of the French Revolution, but I'd like to. Then we get the second half of his life, which is as what his father was doing, husbanding the land. And this is, to me, the biggest selling point on why I think he wasn't gay. Going back to the gay. He attacked this problem, this war-torn country he had, the same as he attacked war. I mean, it's waking up at 5 every day. It would be, he'd go to a town. It's decimated. He's like, okay, you're in charge. Give me the worst decimation and, give me the numbers. What are we looking at? And he's like, well, these are young people. They're going to rebuild on their own. But these people, if they could get X, Y, and Z, these industries could get back. And so we would like this many houses built here. He's like, I can give you 4 instead of 7. You pick where the 4 need to be. I think they should be this, this, and this with these people. And here are 3 horses because he had all these cavalry. Took all the war horses and dispensed them as best he could. I'm talking like, who are the poorest? Send them a horse. I'm going to try and send them grain. I can only give you so much money because I don't have any just yet. It was literally as much of an effort to lift this entire area up as it had been to win that war. And I think they call him Frederick the Great after a couple of battles. But I think we remember him as Frederick the Great because of this heavy lift he did on the back end. And it was constant. It was constant. And if travel in that time, it's by, carriages without springs or on horseback. He would constantly be out in the rain, constantly sleeping in a shed or in a simple hotel. Like, very not pretentious about it. It worked wonders, right? The people loved him because he was constantly trying to do his best. He instituted multiple law reforms. There was one case where these people owned a mill, and you need water to grind, and the grind sells flour. Well, the Lord above wanted a pond for fish because he wanted to grow fish, so he diverted some of the water. Now with less water, they can grind their mill less, so now they can't pay their rent. He's like, give me what you owe. Don't have enough because of his pond. Not my problem. They take it. They appeal to the king, which anyone could do. They appeal to the king, and he sends it to this court. He sends it to that court. All the appeal process he goes through, and every time everyone's looking like, well, it says you lost your appeal here, and I got to go with that, so you lose. And it eventually gets to where he sends 4 guys. They look at the whole case. They sign off on it again. No relief for this miller. He looks at the case. He calls them in. Now, he's very old. I think it's hard for him to walk because of gout. Didn't stop him. He called these 4 people in, and he's like, they were paying their rent fine, yes? They're like, yes. And they own a mill which needs water, yes? Yes. And they have less water because of his pond, right? Yes. So isn't that unfair? They're like, yeah. And he's like, so why the crap Did you sign my name to this crap that says it's legal for them to do if it's unfair? They're like, well, there's some law from 1533. He's like, fair and right should override any law, period. If the law isn't fair, then that's a different problem. But this person shouldn't suffer because of that old law is binding you in a way. If you know it's unfair, just fix it. And he forced them to fix it, sent dudes to jail. Very hilarious. But on top of big overarching things, he would look down on little people's issue, normal people's issues. Daily, he's looking at stuff. On top of, like, at the same time he's doing this, he's dealing with the new Kaiser Joseph, who wants, to take Bohemia, to take all these pieces, to his big grand ideas. We can't get any of them done. But he wants to take Bohemia. And in this, Frederick the Great makes a kind of a pact for the first time, wherein all the German princes of the Reich, that's what they call it, which if you get to Hitler times is why it's the Third Reich. It's the third kingdom of Germans, I guess. But all the princes of the Reich will help each other to make sure none of them gets overrun by any bigger powers, if that ever happens. Not if they aggress out. If you aggress out, it's probably your problem. But internally, we're not letting it happen. And so, it's the first idea of a unified Germany that didn't hold because the French Revolution happened and then chaos broke out everywhere. But the idea, I think, started here and was very successfully done through Frederick the Great, on top of all this other stuff he was doing. Now, I mentioned the gay again because they're at the very end. And I'm talking after about 6 or 7 months. Okay, he's 73. And he goes on a military review that takes about 6 hours, in which he is in the rain the whole time. Then after, he sits in his wet clothes and does business before he takes everything off, goes to bed. Of course you catch a cold or some kind of cough or something. But he lives with the cough until it degenerates into more gout and other illnesses. So much so that at some point he can't sleep lying down, right? And so he's in this chronic state through the winter in a place that's not very well heated, right? It's drafty. Why? Because I don't know why he wouldn't pick a better house. He says it's a waste. And so for 6 or 7 months, he's just slowly deteriorating till he gets to a point he can't get up, constantly coughing. He can barely talk. But they always say his eyes are still sharp. Like the day before he's dead, and you've called doctors in, they can't help your cause. He has some awareness that this thing is ticking out. The day before he's dead, he wakes up at like 4 a.m, and it's mundane little cases like this. It's, I can't go out to the military review, but here's what I want to see. Here are the names of people who should get advancements if they do good. Here's how you punish the ones who do bad in this way for this long. Here's what we're doing about this shipping thing out of this area, etc. I mean, just to the letter. Day before he dies. The day he dies, he wakes up late and instantly is trying to sit up or, to try and talk out his orders for the day, and he's lost the ability to talk. No speech anymore. And they say that's in his eyes when you see him dim a little, like the frustration of not being able to talk. Mike, you're chronically sick, and you're going to work to the literal day you die for your citizenry, for farmers, for military, for grand ideas and small. I'm like, that's a level of dedication that makes me believe that he just didn't bother having an heir for every other reason he had. He just didn't bother with women. He was actually that focused. If you're going to be that focused after being sick that long, the day before you die, you put that kind of a workload in. There's no way that comes because you're old. That's been a lifelong habit. He's been that dedicated for 45 years. And if you're that dedicated, you just don't have time for a relationship. People are like that all the time. You at some point they decide to make time for a relationship, but if they don't, they'll just die without ever having one. No kids, no nothing. Just worked till they died. That's what he did. That's how this book ends. Very, very quickly after that, right? He's buried in this tomb, and our writer, who has been talking to us this whole time, bids us adieu. I've finished my book. I think there's a small section of some other side stories that didn't make it in, but I'm going to read those later. It's really wild when you read one of these long documentaries, how it sort of embeds in you, where you feel like, like I feel like I lost a friend or something. I've been with this book so long. I love this feeling. Okay, I talked longer than I realized. Hopefully that edits down a little bit, but now it's time for our ads. These are my books. None of them are a biography of anyone. They're not real. They're all made up. They're also in no way this long. Give them a listen too if you want to help the channel. I think you'll like them. You can buy them, or you can get them on Kindle Unlimited, sort of like Spotify but with books. I'll get a little cheddar that way too, I suppose. Yeah. Frederick the Great. Great book. I will talk to you, lovely lot, next week.